Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. Now, you know my guest today as an illustrious former foreign minister of South Korea and also as an illustrious Secretary General of the United Nations. But what you don't know is that he has very close and intimate India connections which mean a lot to him. He's written about them in his recently published autobiography, and here it is, it's called Resolved. Joining me now to talk about the book, and more importantly about his India connections, is the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. Welcome to the program, Mr. Ban.
Thank you. Namaste ji. क्या हालचाल है? करण थाप साहब, थापाल साहब.
मेरे हालचाल बहुत अच्छे हैं सर, और आपको हिंदी सुन के दिल बहुत खुश हुआ.
Thank you.
I want to start, Mr. Ban, by talking about something no one in India really knows about, your India connection. It was your first diplomatic posting. Your son was born in New Delhi. Your son-in-law is Indian. Tell me, do you have an emotional closeness to this country?
As of course, you know, India and Korea have started most recently since 1950, when Indian medical teams came to help Korean people who were in the midst of the war. And there were many Indian people who were really here in working for the United Nations. Then, as you said, my first diplomatic posting as a young, very young junior diplomat, I was posted in India in 1972. That time, India and Korea didn't have a formal diplomatic relationship until December 1973. So then I was the one who was very energetic and really fully committed to learn much more. I learned a lot from Indian people. Then my son was born there. Then after many decades, I didn't, expect that my own daughter would marry to an Indian man who is now working as the resident coordinator in China. He is the highest UN staff, covering all the more than 27 United Nations agencies stationed in China. He was head of UN agencies in Kenya just before moving to India. And then my own daughter is now working in New Delhi, in UNICEF office in Delhi. She was transferred from South Sudan very recently, I think less than a month now. She is there. And my grandson is now in China with his father. Now, we normally, Korean diplomacy believes, there is some tendency to believe that India is a propitious place. You will see that those people who work in India as a Korean diplomat, one became the Prime Minister of Korea, 5 became Foreign Minister of Korea, including myself, and there are a number of Vice Foreign Ministers. So all these are top-ranking Korean diplomats were produced from India connection. So India is virtually chairman country of non-aligned states, and India has many distinguished, global leaders.
Clearly, Mr. Ban, India is lucky for Koreans, and it's definitely been lucky for you. But let me go back to that first posting. It was October 1972 when you came to India. It was December 73 when formal relations were established, and you were second secretary in the Korean ministry. You were 28, and this is what you write. It was such an exciting time in my life. What was life in Delhi like in those days?
Of course, at that time, India has such a long history, cultural history, particularly, and spiritual, religious. And Indians are very hardworking and very compassionate. And you are living with so many different ethnicities, like many different ethnicities, and you are really promoting harmony, and order among harmony, among all different ethnic groups.
But Mr. Ban, what was it like to be in Delhi when you were 28, your first job? What was that like? Because you say it was a very exciting time. What was Delhi like for a young 20-year-old South Korean diplomat?
Why I chose to work in India was, first of all, I really wanted to learn much more from all this very spiritual sometimes and inspirational. And Indira Gandhi was also prime minister at that time. And India has produced many distinguished leaders, and they are very strong in diplomacy, very well, and Indian diplomats are well trained, and they are playing very important role in the United Nations.
Sure.
So this is what I really wanted to learn from India, and my expectation was materialized when I became foreign minister and finally the Secretary General of the United Nations.
Now, your Wikipedia entry says, and I'm quoting from that Wikipedia entry, Ban reportedly accepted a posting to India rather than the United States, because in India he would be able to save more money to send to his family. Is that true?
That is also one of the aspects, true. Yeah, because, India was a very poor country. Korea was also a very poor country. My parents were not well-to-do, and I had to be independent on my own. As you may remember, at that time, in 1972, the per capita income was very low, maybe less than $500 per capita incomes. And our aim at that time, my ambassador used to say to Indian public that by 1980, we will achieve $1,000 per capita income, something like this. So that much, both India and Korea was very poor. But for me, I really wanted to save some money for my own life, rather than going to Washington, which would cost a lot of money for my life. So that was one aspect. But I was a desk officer while I was working in Seoul as a junior officer. I was in charge with India, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Maldives Island, and all these Southeast Asian countries were within my jurisdiction.
Absolutely. Now, you write in your book, and I'm quoting from your book, I tell the Indian people that half of my heart belongs to their country. Do you visit often, or is half of your heart often separated from the country it belongs to?
Of course, as a diplomat, I visit your country often as a foreign minister or vice minister and some other capacity. And as a foreign minister, I think I visited several times. And even after my retirement, before lockdown began, I visited your country.
Now,
As a former Secretary General.
Now, by a very interesting coincidence, in 2006, when you were standing for election as Secretary General of the United Nations, I gather your strongest competitor and rival was an Indian, Shashi Tharoor. Was it a tough
Yes.
fight?
He had a long service in the United Nations, first of all. He's coming from, his background was, India. India was almost a chairman country of non-aligned. More than 125 countries at that time, non-aligned belongs. And I have known him. I had had a very good personal relationship. I first met him in 2001 when I was working as a chief of staff to the president of the United Nations General Assembly. Korea was taking a rotating presidency of the General Assembly at that time, and I worked as his chief of staff. At that time, Shashi Tharoor was Undersecretary General for Department of Public Information, all communications. And during 1 year of my tenure there, we had a very close relationship. I didn't realize that later we would be competing each other. Of course, India is a big country, a very powerful country, while Korea was also quite significantly important country at that time. We had a good, fair competition.
Was it a tough fight?
Tough fight. I think India, he was coming from India. But as I said, I may be wrong, but the rumor was saying that he was not much strongly supported by the Indian government per se, because India was more interested in the Security Council. As you know, India is one of the 4 big countries who are aspiring to achieve a permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council, like India, Brazil, Japan, and Germany. So we thought that the Indian government was more interested in becoming permanent members of the Security Council through reform of the Security Council. And then I think there is a saying that you cannot have both, 2 good things.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this in your book. In your book, you write, and I'm quoting, Tharoor did not have the strong support of his government. And you make one further point about Shashi Tharoor. You also say that he overestimated the appeal of his UN service to world leaders. How did you find that out?
Because already by that time, Kofi Annan was the Secretary General. He's the only one who became Secretary General who served as a staff in the United Nations. No other person until now. So it's rare. Then if there would be second such cases, I thought that the member state might not have wanted that kind of a choice. That was my own thinking. But he, as you know, as Undersecretary General of the UN DPI, Department of Public Information, he had a lot of good connections and relationship with global media, like CNN and the Washington Post, the New York Times, etc., etc. So he is a very, I realized that he had a very good such communication capacities and skills. Yeah.
And are you suggesting that he was able to use his connections with global media to give himself publicity? And did that make it difficult for you?
I think I one day saw that he had a half an hour CNN interview only focused on him, while I was not given that kind of. It's rare that one CNN or some other global media would focus on somebody, on who would be a candidate. So I was a little bit envious, envious.
Now, in your book, you mention details about how the election happened. It happened over 4 straw polls, and at the end of the third, the French, you discovered, had voted against you. And since they are permanent members, that would be an effective veto. So you write in your book, and I'm quoting, I telephoned Foreign Minister Philippe Douste-Blazy to ask for an explanation. He asked me outright to appoint a French national to head the UN Department of Peacekeeping and Operations, an important, highly visible job that Secretary General Annan had filled with a succession of Frenchmen. Clearly, the French were trying to twist your hand. Did you have to agree and make a secret deal to get their vote?
It was not the secret. I didn't want to make any secret deal. My answer was that I'm just one of the candidates. And if you really want to have that kind of post, a specific post, I think the first thing is that you should elect me. You should support me to become Secretary General. Then, it's up to me to consider or not. That was my answer. I didn't specifically said, I will do that. It's not, a deal. It was not a deal.
Okay. Now, your book also explains in some detail the very strong support you got from the United States. Even before your candidature was publicly known, Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State, assured you of her support. Then during the voting, you met President George Bush, and he made it absolutely clear that you would be his candidate. And interestingly, just before the third straw poll, when the critical P5 countries were trying to find a common candidate, your book suggests that Condoleezza Rice cleverly maneuvered the Chinese foreign minister to propose your name. Would you say that US support was critical to your success?
I think US is one of the P5s, but US support is critically important. In any case, in the United Nations, of course, all the members are equal. All the members are equal, and all P5s are equal. But the United States, practically speaking, is very important. Very important. So when you can say that equally important, but among equal, there is always somebody or some country who really excels. This is, I think, United States is that country. I didn't get any specific answer from Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. She said that I trust you, but you should reach out member states. Then I realized that she would be favorably disposed. She would be favorably disposed. This is what I said. And when I met President Bush, that was already fourth ballot was cast, and it was already known that I had 14 votes in favor, while Shashi Tharoor and others, they had 2 or 3 negative votes already. Nobody knew that where all these negative votes came. That time, my president, President Roh Moo-hyun, was having summit meeting, and he asked President Bush for a favorable consideration for my candidature. And then he asked me, why do you want to run this most impossible job? Then I explained my vision to him. That time, I think that he said very positively.
Absolutely. And all of that is in your book. Now, shortly after you became Secretary General, Shashi Tharoor resigned from the United Nations, ending a 30-year relationship with that organization.
That's right. Yeah.
Would you, as Secretary General, have liked him to stay on, or would it have been difficult for two people who had been rivals for the same job to work together?
He was, I'm grateful to him. He was gracious when it was apparent after having the fourth straw poll, those straw polls should not be disclosed. Somehow, it's immediately disclosed to the public, even though it was a straw poll. Then Shashi Tharoor came to me. I was just a candidate. Then he said that he would resign from his candidacy. Then that has sparked the resignation by all other remaining candidates, because he was number two. And when number two resigned, then I think all other candidates, they resigned immediately, almost immediately. Then I became only one single candidate. Then few days left. On September 9, suddenly North Korea tested first nuclear weapons, surprising the whole world. We immediately I thought, and I think the member state of the United Nations, particularly Security Council, must have thought that North Korea was trying to derail or obstruct my election to this post of Secretary General. The notion, my concern was that I was coming from a divided country, confronting between South and North Korea. And North Korea can play negatively against my candidature.
Absolutely.
Then member state of the Security Council took immediate action on that time.
But the interesting point you made, Mr. Ban, is that it was Shashi's gesture, which you called a gracious gesture, to resign his candidacy, that led to all the other competitors resigning as well, and you became Secretary General immediately.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's I'm grateful for his gesture. Yeah.
Now, the amazing thing is your Indian connection actually grew further after you became Secretary General, because you chose India's former permanent representative to the United Nations, Vijay Nambiar, to be your chef de cabinet. Why did you choose him?
I have longer than 50 years, since 72, we were counterparts. He was undersecretary in the Asia department of the external ministry, and he was my counterpart. And we used to meet, he was in charge of South and North Korea. So I had to meet many times already. Then I met him at the United Nations when he was counselor. Then I was the first secretary at the respective mission, Korean mission and Indian mission. So we had a very good talks with him. Then later, when I became the chief of staff to the president of the General Assembly in 2001, Vijay Nambiar was permanent representative, ambassador of India to the United Nations. So I think naturally we have been keeping all this personal relationship. And then when I became Secretary General, he was special assistant for political affairs to Kofi Annan. I met him working after retirement from the Indian Foreign Service. He was working for Kofi Annan. So naturally, we knew each other. Then I thought that somebody, if I wanted to appoint somebody as my chief of staff, we normally say chef de cabinet, chief of staff. I asked him, why don't you join my team? That's why, we've been working very closely. Then later, I appointed him as my special envoy to Myanmar. Even these days, I often communicate with him.
Quite clearly, he's more than a colleague. He's an old friend, and it's a friendship that goes back, as you said, 50 years to 1972, when you were 28 and at your first job in Delhi. And I imagine Vijay Nambiar must have been about the same age too. So it's a very old, friendly
He's
relationship.
1 year elder, 1 year older, 29, 1 year older. Then he is a very respected diplomat, very respected diplomat. He may not be seen as a passionate, but his way of addressing all the issues are very professional. And his communication, in particularly all these documents and the conversation with the other staff and diplomat, he was very respected by staff of the United Nations as well as ambassadors and diplomatic corps. And I really enjoyed working with him.
Now, before I end, I want Secretary General to talk about Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan civil war came to its climax and its end in 2009 when you were Secretary General.
Mhm.
In April of that year, you called for a humanitarian ceasefire because you were worried about civilians who were trapped between the Sri Lankan army and the LTTE. But when you called President Rajapaksa, this is what you write in your book. He kept shouting at me as if he was speaking to his subordinates. It was inappropriate and one of my most embarrassing engagements with any world leader. How did you handle Rajapaksa shouting down the phone at you?
Frankly speaking, I had a very good personal relationship when I was a foreign minister. As you know, in 2004, December and January 2005, there was a big tsunami hitting Indian Ocean countries like Indonesia and Sri Lanka and all these areas. And I participated in the United Nations urgent assistance support conference, which was convened by the Secretary General Kofi Annan in Jakarta at that time. And President Clinton and President Bush came as US special envoys, and I visited Sri Lanka.
Absolutely, sir. I know, in fact, and you mentioned it in your book, that you have known President Rajapaksa not just from the period you're describing, but also when he visited South Korea as Prime Minister. But now, in 2009, you were Secretary General of the UN, ringing him to propose a humanitarian ceasefire. He was president, and he was shouting down the phone as if you were a subordinate. And you said this was not just inappropriate, it was embarrassing. So how did you handle this?
Normally, I really treated as head of state. Of course, I was very much angry, but I didn't show that kind of anger. Later, just 1 or 2 months later, he came to the United Nations on the occasion of during General Assembly. He apologized for that in person. And you see that it was very difficult. As you know, I dispatched Vijay Nambiar when all this conflict between the Tamil minority and also government ended by unilateral and forceful, the military actions. I really wanted to make some post-conflict reconciliation.
Absolutely.
And post-conflict
In fact,
like
you mentioned
accountability.
You mentioned in your book, Secretary General, that just a few weeks after this shouting, you visited Colombo, you met the president, and you write, I'm quoting, President Rajapaksa told me the government would accept accountability for its wartime actions. But the truth is that accountability never happened. Did you feel let down by President Rajapaksa? He made a promise, he did not fulfill it, and that is the situation even today. So did you feel let down?
I saw him. Of course, there was a strong pushback from his chief advisors, including his own brother, who was at the time defense minister. Then he was calling one by one. Look, he's the Secretary General. Now he wants to handle all this in a peaceful way, amicable way. Post-conflict resolution is much more important now. And then he finally agreed to establish their own accountability process. Then they didn't carry out this one. That is why this has been brought up by the Human Rights Council, in Geneva.
But did you feel let down? Did you feel let down? He made a promise to you and he never fulfilled it properly. Did you feel let down?
Well, of course, I was very much disappointed. I was very much disappointed by what he said. And I've been really speaking to him after that several times over telephone. And I also visited Sri Lanka afterwards again on my last year, 2026. And I really wanted to make sure that there is a reconciliation as well as rehabilitation and reconstruction. This is what I really wanted to help Sri Lankan people.
We're coming to the end of this interview. I want to put just 2 or 3 very quick questions to you.
Mm-hmm.
You felt so disappointed by Rajapaksa failing to act effectively that you actually appointed a UN panel of experts who released their reports in 2011 and found, and I'm quoting, credible evidence indicating that war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed by the Sri Lankan military and the separatist militia. But no credible action was taken to bring the guilty to justice. How do you account for that?
Yeah, I expected that the accountability process of which President Rajapaksa established what is known as Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. But they didn't do much about this. Then one good lessons as well as initiative I did was that we have to learn from these Sri Lankan cases. Then I appointed an internal panel to review UN action during the final stage of this conflict. I appointed Charles Petrie. He is a British, who is a very well experienced and who also served in Sri Lanka before. Then,
so can I point out something? I'm quoting from your book. You appointed this internal panel in 2012, and your own book says that they found, and I'm quoting, the whole UN system, that includes you as Secretary General, it includes the Security Council, had failed. And your book says that the UN system failed on 2 counts. Firstly, to call sufficient global attention to the bloodiest phase of the civil war. And secondly, to respond to early warnings. And then you add, the panel specifically criticized the Security Council. I put it to you, that is a huge black mark against the UN.
Yeah, of course, I didn't stop there. That's why I established another very important initiative, Human Rights Up First initiative, front, Human Rights Up Front. This is a HRUF. This is now still very important backbones of systems of the United Nations.
But all of that, Mr. Ban, happened afterwards. Your panel says
of
that
course,
at
yeah.
the time, the UN failed to respond. I put it to you, that is a huge black mark against the UN.
That is true. That is true. And after that, after learning from all this, in fact, all this kind of crisis happened before I became Secretary General. But the final stages, final attacks by the Sri Lankan government took place during my time, and there was a little for our UN could do, because Security Council has never taken any decision. They never taken this issue at the Security Council. They never paid any attention.
Absolutely.
This is, again,
in fact, Mr. Ban, you point that out in your book, that after Sri Lanka was admitted to the United Nations in 55, the Security Council hasn't passed a single resolution about Sri Lanka.
That's true.
And yet the Sri Lankan crisis lasted for several decades. It went on for 30, 40 years. You yourself in your book call it one of the most devastating civil wars the world has ever seen. And yet, despite that, the Security Council didn't pass any resolution at all. Even during the worst phase of the war, the Security Council had nothing to say. And let me, before you answer, quote your explanation. You say, the Security Council was too riven by its members' own domestic politics to take any action. I put it to you, that is a pretty weak excuse for what is actually dereliction of responsibility by the Security Council.
When the Secretariat, including Secretary General, are not able to take any action if and when the Security Council is divided, all the actions like dispatching peacekeeping operations, etc., has to be decided by the Security Council members. Then when Security Council members are divided, as I said in my book, then they have never taken, during the last 3-4 decades, not a single resolution has taken. That is also very regrettable things. That is why there is always claim that Security Council should be reformed. But it is always P5s, yes.
You're saying it's very regrettable. Will you accept that at the critical time when the Security Council should have acted, and remember, you called this one of the world's most devastating civil wars. So would you accept the Security Council failed Sri Lanka?
I think so, yes, I agree. Security Council failed Sri Lanka. And in many cases, like in Syria, Security Council has been failing. This is really regrettable things. And that is why there is a strong criticism against the United Nations from the international community. And there is a strong argument that the Security Council should be reformed. But when P5 are not united, then there is nothing which we can do it. Of course, I have established this Human Rights Upfront initiative, and UN Human Rights Council has taken this issue many times since 2000, since the end of this Sri Lankan crisis. And we appointed Marty Ahtisaari, the former Nobel laureate. He also established this.
You were very open in saying that the Security Council's behavior vis-a-vis Sri Lanka, vis-a-vis Syria, was a case of failing those countries.
That's right.
Do you therefore accept that there is urgent need for reform?
I think most of the member states are asking for the Security Council reform should be taken, but Security Council is not moving because P5s are always divided. But when it comes to Security Council reform, I think the Security Council, they are united not to take any action.
But do you, as a former Security Council Secretary General, believe reform is urgent?
I think so. Yes. Yeah.
My
Otherwise,
last-
United Nations will always be criticized by international community.
So you agree that reform is urgent?
Yes.
Did you say yes, sir?
Yeah. Yes.
My last question. I'm going back to Sri Lanka very briefly. I want to quote what I think is your own personal comment on Sri Lanka. You write in your book, I do know we should have tried harder to protect human rights and to prevent atrocities. Would you today accept that perhaps because you failed to try harder and you failed to prevent atrocities, maybe you owe the Sri Lankan people an apology?
This is it's not an issue of apology. I think when the United Nations was not able to help them, then it is Sri Lankan people should also be responsible for what they have not been able to reconcile each other. They have been fighting themselves between the government and against the Tamil ethnicities. So the problem happens from them. It's not the United Nations caused any such kind of things.
I
Of
understand.
course, I admit that the United Nations has failed to address all these issues according to UN Charter. But there are many different issues. But it's not an issue of I apologize to the people of Sri Lanka. I think Sri Lankan people look themselves into what
Okay.
they had done, why they have not done enough in accordance with the UN Charter. It's up to the, first of all, political leadership. They have not done their mandate, mandated by the Sri Lankan people. And they have not listened to what the United Nations was doing.
All right, Mr. Bond, let's leave it there. I thank you for this interview. I thank you in particular for revealing your emotional connection with India. I thank you for the fact that you spoke in Hindi and also for the fact that you have publicly said that the Sri Lankan case was a terrible case, but the Security Council failed Sri Lanka. Yet you add, that doesn't mean there's any need for apology. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you very
Take care.
much. Okay.
Stay safe.
All the best. All the best. Thank you.